Good evening. I'm going to try that one again. Good evening. Thank you. Welcome, everybody. My name is Crystal Marks. My pronouns are she and they, and I am the Executive Director of Seattle Pride, and I want to welcome you tonight to Seattle Out and Proud Foundation, our C3, Pride Speaks. Welcome, everybody. We are incredibly excited to have you with us in person. That is amazing. If you're not cheering for being in person, it's okay, but I am on the inside. I miss seeing your beautiful faces. I want to first thank our amazing panelists and hosts for being here this evening. It means a lot to us to have people in our community speaking about our community. It is crucial that when we have stories told about us, that we are the author of those stories, we are the editor of those stories, and that we are our own publisher of those stories as well. So that's what Pride Speaks is all about. It is a chance for the LGBTQIA+ community to tell our own stories on issues that are important to us. So I said we were with the Seattle Out and Proud Foundation. That is our 501c3 arm of Seattle Pride. If you have heard of Seattle Pride before, it's probably from the Seattle Pride Parade, which is back this year after a long 3-year hiatus, thanks to the panorama, that we will call that. And we are so excited to be with you. We also have Pride in the Park on June 4th. That will be at Volunteer Park at noon. That's up in Cap Hill. And the Seattle Pride Parade is on Sunday, June 26th, kicking off at 11 a.m. right at Westlake Park. So we are here tonight to talk about something very important, so I won't waste too much more of your time. Let me just pull open a very important bio. I'm going to introduce our host for this evening. Sonatina Sanchez, she, her, is the autistic, queer, Latinx founder of Crafting Sound Meaning. As an autistic raised by autistic parents, she pulls from her experience navigating a world designed for autistics, or non-autistic people, to help her community build deep and lasting relationships to resist and thrive in our modern capitalist hellscape. You can visit her webpage at craftingsoundmeaning.com to learn more and connect with her. And now I'm going to pass it over to Sonatina to lead us through this panel. And again, thank you all for coming out tonight. It means the world to us. Please feel free to stop by and pick up a sticker, a button, or a magazine at the front. And we look forward to seeing you again soon.
Thank you so much. I am so honored to be here. Hello, once again, my name is Sonatina. And I am very honored to be joined here by 3 fabulous panelists who I am going to now introduce through their little important bios. So to my immediate right, I have Alicia Crane. Alicia is a Detroit native and has held several leadership positions in corporate banking, education, business, and the nonprofit sector in Silicon Valley. She moved to the greater Seattle area in 2014 and is now one of only a few women of color in corporate philanthropy. Very nice. Alicia, she served on many boards and commissions centered around equity and inclusion, and currently serves on the City of Edmonds Planning Board, as well as Vice Chair of the Snohomish County Kingfield Airport Commission. She is currently the Chief Development and Equity Officer at Work, a highly supportive and innovative conduit between people with disabilities and employers in the community. Prior to this role, she was leader in major fundraising and partnership roles at YWCA, Seattle King County Snohomish, City Year Seattle, and Washington Business Week. Welcome, Alicia.
Thank you.
In the middle here, we have Emma King, she, they, Trepanion HR and ERG founder. Emma King is a queer non-binary femme with EDS, that's Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, and neurodivergence, and primarily has experience with workplace advocacy in larger organizations. Emma is passionate about diversity, equity, and inclusion, and has an MSW and a bachelor's in women and gender studies. And she's founded 3 employee resource groups centered on queerness and disability and neurodivergence. Currently, Emma works at Trepanion as an onboarding specialist, helping new team members find their way into the organization, and of course, making sure that path is accessible and considers all of their needs. Welcome. And last but not least at all, we have Christiana Obey-Summers, they, them, is principal and owner of Epiphanies of Equity. Christiana Obey is Sumner, is a Black, Indigenous, queer, non-binary, and multiply disabled person, community organizer, and activist. They are CEO and principal consultant of Epiphanies of Equity, LLC, a social equity consulting firm that particularly specializes in social change, intersectionality, anti-racism, and disability justice. Welcome. All right, so to get started, let us go to the first question that I, pass around to people. So we're going to start off by talking about all of those different identities that we listed today. So first question, how do you feel your multiple intersecting identities have informed each other throughout your life? Would anybody like to start?
I think pronouns in general is new for me, and I think for most people that are straight, it took a while to try to understand why are pronouns important. And I think it really opened up a conversation around, not only understanding where you lay in that, but also being able to respect where other people are. And it does open up a conversation, and I think especially as someone who grew up, I grew up in Detroit, so and also as a Black person in America, you didn't talk outside of what the norms were. And so to be able to feel a level of bravery, if you will, to say, or to challenge the norms that have been placed upon us, and to say, this is who I identify as, this is where my comfort is, this is who I am as this person, not what's on this sheet of paper or whatever the societal norm has created for us. It's created a whole new level of understanding. And I know for myself, especially now that someone that works, advocating for persons with disabilities, intersectionality really stands out for me now. Because I think a lot of times you can think of, DEI around African Americans or, being a person of color, but disability doesn't discriminate, And so all of that is to say that I think it's really opened up more channels of conversations that have been uncomfortable, starting with understanding the depths of pronouns and what it means for people.
Nice. Christiana?
All right. It's not really, it's inextricable, all of the things, because they work together like a stew. You can't really take something out of the stew without having flavors of the other things. I think about, Washington is the 7th state I've lived in. We moved around a lot because we were under-resourced. And I'm also one of those folks who moved to where the resources were, but I call Camden County, New Jersey my home, because that's sort of where most of my development was, from age 10, 11 to 19. So we lived in this place called Town, which is a historic Black town within a historically white middle class town within a county where a lot of Black folks were sort of segregated to the Delaware, right? And the reason why that's important is because I'm autistic, sick and bad. So, especially as an autistic kid, born in the late 80s, ADA did not help a lot of folks, but it definitely didn't help intersectionally. And I was not getting IEP plans. I was being seen as sort of a behavioral nuisance because I didn't do things right. But that happens. I'm not saying that the other kids, who were in, sort of in this sort of space of, is this child disabled or does he have a behavioral issue, which is in a way a disability? We shared some of that systemic ableism, but it was precisely because I was, I was presenting as femme back then, but how things are. When I was a STEM child, I was a Black child where we were down the street from Camden, so there's also that. I was a fat person, so there's also that. So now there's also the fat Black girl stereotype, because it's all coming together. Then I'm autistic, then I'm sick. So there's all this stuff where there's not really a way to talk about it without saying it's all in the sauce. You can't really take it. You can't really take it away. It's all within one galaxy of each other, and I think that's what gets so hard especially when you start talking to these institutions and these structures and these systems, because they want you to pull out that one bit and silo yourself and turn yourself into these piecemeal pieces and say, well, we're just talking about race right now. We're not talking about disability, we're not talking about that. And it's like, well, then you're not talking about me. So it's hard, because I don't really know how to see them separately, but I do see how, just like with like different spectrums of light, it takes different tools or whatever to be able to see them and process them.
Yeah. Emma?
Yeah, as a white child, I definitely identified as femme and feminine for a little while, and then tomboy for a little while, and had neurodivergence, but I was with a lot of neurodivergent kids. We kind of grew up in a quasi-mixed immigrant area where there were a lot of white kids, a lot of brown kids, and not very many black kids in Arizona, at least not in Phoenix when I was living there. But it was definitely more of kind of everyone. Definitely the stew metaphor resonates. We had a lot of ingredients that we didn't know how to identify. None of us really realized that anything was quote unquote wrong with any of us until we were, young adults and things kind of became unavoidable. Lots of sprained joints with EDS. They're like, oh, maybe that's actually a thing. 9 sprained ankles in a year is probably not normal. That kind of stuff. But definitely, I think that we also, like, as a dominant group of like by skin color, we kind of tend to go, oh, hey, yeah, we don't really have intersectionality because we don't really have an identity. And it's like, no, you have a dominant identity that is actually important to acknowledge, and that to dismantle privilege, you have to acknowledge that you have it. And I don't think I really did that until I was at least in high school and much later. So I definitely have been discovering things about myself, including the non-binary part of myself, for the last 10 years, and I'm glad I did.
So that's interesting that you bring that up, because as we have, Christiana and Alicia and I, who are from ethnic backgrounds and had to understand that intersectionality dynamics from childhood, basically from birth, and it took you until high school to realize that there were other identities out there, even potentially. So that brings me to this next question, and I'd love for you to follow up on that a bit. In what brought you here to this panel? So when did you first identify as queer and/or disabled, and what factors affected your decision? So we'll ask, obviously, conversation, but I'd like to start with you, because that really does relate a lot to what you were just saying.
Yeah, sure, yeah. I was definitely a closeted queer kid. I identified as bisexual in college, so early 20s, probably 2021. I joined our college's LGBTQ coalition at Arizona State when Prop 8 was in the books, and I went to some meetings and was like, wow, I feel really strongly about this. Like, really strongly about, I feel so strong. Okay, maybe I'm part of this community a little bit. We were the token straight kids in the community, and now my partner is trans, and I'm non-binary too, so I was like, it's nice to figure that out eventually. But it took a lot longer for me to figure out the disability portion, partly because of the disability imposter syndrome thing, where it's like, I see somebody walking down the street and they have an invisible disability, and it looks like, oh, they're not as disabled as I am. You start like making ranks and hierarchies of how disabled someone is. It's like the oppression Olympics, right? It's like, oh, when I applied for a disabled permit for the first time, because I experienced pretty extreme pain when I'm like walking from my car to the grocery store sometimes, my doctor was like, oh, but that's for people who are actually like really disabled. And I was like, well, so I have to qualify as disabled to you, and pain doesn't count. Okay, cool, check that box in my head. So that took me until I was probably 32 to identify as in any way.
You said 32?
Yeah. Until I was at least 32, maybe 33. I'm 34 now.
So, well, yeah, that's valid, because as we go through our lives, right, that brings up the point where when we claim identities throughout our lives, because you say you were a closeted queer kid, and yet you came out in college or a little bit after, so in your 20s, and now you claim disability in your 30s. So who knows what you might claim in your 40s?
I'm excited. Your guess is as good as mine.
Yeah. Alicia, do you have anything about when you claim now?
I would say, so being someone that works for an organization that serves persons with IDD or intellectual developmental disabilities has really opened my eyes personally to what disability means. And I think to your point, I feel like imposter syndrome around disability, because I've always had something wrong with my health, but it was never, tagged as a disability. And it was just, you're just sick. Like, I'm just forever sick. So, whether it's my kidney disease that I'm still dealing with, for 20 years. Having gotten cancer twice and thankfully beaten it both times, I never labeled it, or it was never presented to me as you have a disability, you're just sick. And ironically, watch this here, but once I started working it at work and being at home though, and I started experiencing more pain. So like, okay, it's just pain. And I'm thinking maybe I twisted my ankle because my ankles were just hurting really bad. It was just hurt to walk. It hurt to just lay in bed. And so finally I was like, I'm just gonna go to the doctor because I hate going to the doctor because they tell me I have something. But I get there and that's when I'm saying, oh, you have osteoarthritis. Knees and ankles and I'm like, okay. And so then when the PA gave me the form to get my temporary disabled parking thing, I'm like, all right, really? So it is. And so, I had this really long talk with my doctor about that afterwards, and he goes, yeah, I'm sorry that this was never explained to you, or that this does qualify as disability, everything leading up to this point. So it's a newness for me, and especially being in this DEI space, and wanting to make sure that disability is included at the forefront of those conversations. I feel like it's my mission now, so that's what landed me here, is to make sure that people understand that, and it is, again, like we said, intersectionality, that it goes across the gamut. So it needs to be talked about everywhere, and now that I can personally relate to it, it stands out even more.
Christiane.
Yeah. There's sort of like a helix with this question, because disabled and queer are two different stories. They're kind of related. But a lot of it has to do with my family. My family, everyone in my family, and if my family watches this, there's no one that's going to yell at me, because everyone in my family is disabled in some way. And so disability was less as something to be seen as like a negative, and more something to be seen as like, let's teach you strategy, because you're disabled and under-resourced and poor, and you don't have insurance, and so we're going to teach you how to use herbs and the different sort of stuff for medicine, because you're not going to get medicine. We're never going to teach you what to look out for and what the script is so you can stay safe. In terms of queerness, though, that's a different story, because I think that there's people in my family who are LGBTQIA+, but I saw how my family interacted with them, and so that already created a barrier. But I was one of those kids where they already knew, kind of. So I swear, starting when I was 10 or so, my mom started asking me yearly, it's okay to talk to me about this, how you're feeling. And I think it was maybe because I was sneaking watching but I'm a cheerleader at the gate and stuff like that. But the kicker though is that my mom and some other members of my family are LDS. So there was also
that's Mormon if you weren't unaware.
Yeah. And so that was a whole different dimension, because they clocked me there too. And so there was situations where
I don't know about you, but having also a Mormon family, I think that they're the best gaydar of anybody.
Seriously, I was 14 wanting to go on because they have these youth camps every year, multiple youth camps every year. And I was going to young women's camp, which is for between 12 and 18, and they almost stopped me. They're like, we gotta have a conversation about your same-sex attraction. I'm like, okay. I think it's hard because my mom definitely wanted a girly girl, was a stage mom, put me in pageants, which I learned how to win because it's all about the construct of femininity. But it was really great. I think I knew that I was queer right away, and I knew I was disabled right away, because I've always been disabled, and I've always been in this space. I think that if I'm talking about when did I become politically disabled or politically queer, which means like I start talking about it in a way, like you're saying, like we gotta talk about it. I think I started talking about being disabled very young as a youth leader, as I started going down the school to institutionalization pipeline.
Mm-hmm.
So I noticed in high school they were gearing me up to be institutionalized.
Mm-hmm.
Not to go to college in that institution, but what ended up for me being about 6 to 7 years of pretty intense hospitalization and stuff in Kentucky. And Kentucky has no patient rights. So it was, I came to Seattle to get away from that because it was, because I was going to get stuck there, pretty much. Because that's what happens in these situations. So when I came to Seattle was when I think I was able to exhale, and I was able to continue disability advocacy and autism. I didn't really get my chronic disabilities until around 2015, and that was due to medical violence. That's a different story. But once I came here and I was going to college, I went to college at 25 finally and stuff like that. I was able to start to actually have relationships and it not have the policing of the church and the family and institutions and the Seroquel and all the stuff, right? And being able to just go and live my life. And so I think that led me to be doing more campus advocacy at Seattle University. I think my favorite one is that they have this thing called and I'll show. They have this thing called they have this environmental report they had done on trans inclusion at Seattle University, and they didn't want to release it. They didn't want to release it even to us as youth leaders. I was on the student council, and it's a Catholic school, right?
Yep.
Seattle University.
We shared this experience. I was also on the well, when I was there, it was the Associated Students of Seattle University.
Yes.
But they changed it, I heard, after because they didn't like being called ASU for some reason.
ASU. that was SGSU, but it's ASU. It was ASU when this happened too.
Yeah.
And it was the last year. And so like, I was like, you need to release the report, and they wouldn't do it. And we had all of the students' support, but they still wouldn't sign it. So we did like this sort of like gauntlet open comment at the last ASSU meeting, because they had all their little fancy catered dinners and everything like that. I'm like, no, you're going to release the city report. So we had all of the students from the Office of Multicultural Affairs Lounge and the Lavender Lounge, and it was like public comment after public comment after public comment until they finally signed it. But I kind of got blacklisted after that. But anyway, that was really my first. I am.
Yeah.
And that was when you were in college?
Yeah. Well, politically, yeah.
Oh, yeah. So that is actually interesting because again, that brings us to our next question. Sort of, it's like you all like knew where the conversation was going somehow. But no, because that's the thing. Like these questions. One of the reasons I also put them in this order is because these conversations kind of do have a flow to them. And so what I wanted to follow up on, and you can take a breath if you want, but. The aspect of being involved in advocacy efforts because you're the only one that is in the room with that particular feature. And this goes along with queerness, disability, ethnicity, gender, all of these aspects. And so, I'm wondering, Alicia, do you want to start? Emma, do you want to start this time? You know?
Go for it.
Yeah.
So wow, I don't know how to keep that answer short either. I think for I would say for me
Let it
personally,
go.
I would
Let
say
it
for
go.
me personally, I'm used to being the only or the first.
Uh-huh.
And it took a while for me. I would say maybe finally in my mid-20s where I was like, you know what? If I'm gonna walk in the room and everyone's gonna stop and stare, I might as well take advantage of the captive audience and say what I want to say and do what I want to do. And and to this day, it's the same thing where you walk in and someone's looking at me like I would say the airport commission, for example, and that was Snohomish County, and I'm the chair now. Yay!
Yeah.
But when I got appointed to that 13-member commission, I was only one of two women, and one person with this skin color. And someone in the room thought I was staff and asked me what the bathrooms were. And I said, I have no idea. But when you know, let me know. And so we go around the table and, everyone's doing their introductions and you could tell again it was more this like, oh, she's the diversity. She's that. And then when we started talking about stuff outside of airlines, when we were talking about master planning, which is land use, there was a whole bunch of quizzical faces in the room. And I was like, oh, let me explain that to you. And then that's when they realized why I was there, and not because of this. And I think it's the same thing when it comes to talking about disability. I think one of the things, going back to your earlier question, to tie into this one is, I think there's a sense that disability means something physical. And so we have to talk about it. And I was guilty of that myself, and so even now, you're like, oh, no, IDD, you're always, there are invisible disabilities.
Yeah.
And it shouldn't be regulated to, oh, if you're visibly limping or even this and this and that must somehow be the thing. And so when you have something that's not quote unquote obvious, it can make that person that's the first or the only feel like they can't speak up or there's too much attention. But one of the things I'm proud of but one of the great things about pushing past that is the advocacy work around this. We talk about persons with disabilities in the workplace, which is what, At Work focuses on. Do you know what sub-minimum wages are?
Sub-minimum wage is the law of the land for many, many disabled people right now.
Yes. And so federally, it's still legal. It's exactly what it sounds like, which is a company can pay a person with disabilities doing the same exact role as a fully functioning, in their opinion, person less, just because they have the disability.
And the excuse given back when this was implemented was that the company or whoever's that they're going to be giving extra support.
Yeah.
So this company needs to be supported so that they can provide employment for this poor person.
And your government's got that.
Yeah.
So, and finally, last year with a lot of advocacy work locally, through our organization and other people, the governor signed the bill to ban sub-minimum wages in Washington State. And so that's why we have to talk about it. That's why, we have to help empower and create resources for that one person, for that only person in that situation to feel like they have somebody to reach out to. Because the reality is, I think South Carolina is getting ready to ban it. I read earlier today. But there are states that are doubling down.
You said ban what?
Sub-minimum wage.
Sub-minimum wage, yes.
Yeah, but there are other states that are doubling down on it.
Yep.
So it's really, really important to make sure that when there is someone that kind of feels like they're either blowing in the wind or they're the only ones, to make sure that they know that there are people and resources that can support. Not always perfectly, but can support.
Yeah, I definitely agree. The invisible disabilities are pretty much the #1 category of disability. Most people who have any kind of disabling condition have some amount of function with that condition. Most folks who are blind legally can see just a little bit. Most people who are deaf can hear just a little bit. There's a huge spectrum of disability, and the fact that we have to qualify as disabled to get services, and then also that ticks a box that says we can be paid less, is problematic, to say the least. And it takes a lot of emotional energy to be the sole disabled person in a room, or the only person who is publicly out as disabled. But there's really a lot of disabling conditions. Like pregnancy can be considered to be a temporarily disabling condition, and for many people it ends up having lots of long-term ramifications anyway. Breaking an ankle could be a temporary disability. There's a million different. I am permanently disabled, and so that's the reluctance and the stigma associated with identifying as disabled can be a real drag on getting policies passed and also getting people to volunteer at companies and in general for disability advocacy. But I think that really, like, the people who are, like, when I've already been hired in a job, you know, I'm like, cool, I'm gonna come out to you now. So there's a lot of like, you kind of have conditional privilege anyway, as somebody who has a position at this company, and you can use a little bit of your emotional energy to kind of swing it, even if you don't need necessarily, like I don't need documents with larger text, but I'm advocating for it because that means that the person who has to already advocate for 50 million things to have larger text maybe has one less thing to do. It's hard to be the only person who's raising a hand and saying, I need a thing. And I'm a white middle class person, like I am privileged as all get out. So I think that it's just really important to be on panels and do things like this, just because it's like you don't have to qualify as disabled. If you have trouble doing something that you love to do, you can call yourself disabled. You can say that society disables you, because what it really is society not accommodating something that you need, not providing something that you need, and not allowing you to ask for it.
Really glad you brought that up. Not sure if our audience members are familiar with the social theory of disability, but that is one of the theories currently, that people or an individual themselves is not disabled. It is the society or the community that they live in that determines whether or not they are able to interact with it effectively based on how they are.
Right.
So in many cultures, like there's these things about, what is it, back in like, you know, before history, prehistory, people with ADHD were considered to be the ultimate human because we were like, what's going on? What's going on? Oh no, I'm not gonna die. You know, like that's and so that's like the
That's
answer.
adaptation, baby.
But like now, because of that constant weariness, the aspect of having ADHD is considered disabling, and we have to take drugs in order to like calm ourselves down in order to type and focus and focus and focus. And it's like, what does that mean? There's another reason, and yes, you're next.
I just want to say to this question too about like, I want to underscore everything that folks said about like the importance of actually having these conversations, because if we don't say anything, then nothing will happen. Right? And this is the importance of what people talk about with like actual structural transformative change, and seeing how things are woven into the foundations. Because like, always being the only or first person is really, really tiring.
It's exhausting.
It wears, there's this term called weathering in geology, where the sort of like water will start pitting a rock. It's like that with your soul.
This is a good analogy.
So it's like, it's this piece. I was debating what for sure, because I was thinking about with the minimum wage ban, when I was co-chair at Seattle Disabilities Commission with Sean Bickley, we had fought to get a ban passed at the city of Seattle, and I still have trauma from having to advocate for that. It's like when you're sewing and you use a needle in your sewing machine, you might think fabric is soft, but the needle dulls because it is weathering down over time. And so there's so many of these things that we need to address. But just like Sanatina's talking about the social model of disability, it's woven and baked into the structures, down to the mycelium and the water foundations of our society. So the system isn't broken, the system is working as designed. So we need folks who are not disabled, who have more hit points to use, to help to deconstruct and reconstruct a system that has disabled folks considered at all in it, but really considered with the principles of disability, justice, and equity. And really to have the blueprint written by the people with the most intersectional lived experience, because they're going to have the nuance of the knowledge and the wisdom of what needs to happen. So I think it's important to speak up when you're the only person, when you're experiencing something. You know, there's an abscess that needs to be lanced, essentially. But to be the first person to lance that abscess means that you're always the one that's going to get all of the pus and the crap on you.
You got to enjoy being the popper.
Yeah, I'm a triple Virgo. I don't want to do that. So, it's like solidarity and allyship is important, because I think a lot of times folks will look at some, folks like us, and we're out there and we're doing our thing. But then it's like what they don't see is is the night terrors and the therapy sessions and the anxiety around, you know, not being perfect, because as Hema Olkin added to the white supremacy culture characteristics was about perfectionism and also about qualification. So people don't think you're qualified anymore because you're disabled or you're too, you know, you're not performing the way they want you to, or masking or code switching. Then you don't even have the platform to be able to make the change anymore. And you know, that's the way the system is set up. So yeah.
Yeah, and yeah, this I feel is like sort of like the meat of the evening in a way, right? Because it feels we're coming out of an era where the dominant culture had just basically one model of being. If you weren't, you know, white upstanding citizen, you basically weren't considered a person. You were considered something like person and not just person. And so it feels very exhausting to be the only, but it is necessary to speak up because who else will, you know? And what I wanted to follow up with you, Christiana, on was the aspect of the invisibleness of the behind the scenes stuff. Because, right, one of the things that you as the audience may have noticed is like we've all also been talking about neurodivergence and autism, and as an autistic person who was not diagnosed or wasn't recognized and was actively told I couldn't be autistic because I was too social, like that affected the way that I could show up as the first. And so now I'm showing up as an autistic person in environments where previously I was not autistic, or they didn't know I was autistic, and so I was masking, and all of a sudden now I'm demanding to be treated and communicated with the way that I actually function. And it's disturbing to people. They're like, wait, but you were so easy before. So that's one of the aspects too of being not just being the first, but being the first at while you're also trying to figure out yourself, because that's the thing. People look to us as experts, and it's good that they do, but at the same time, I also like to remind my friends, I'm like, I'm about 2.5 years into my coming out as autistic journey, so I'm still trying to figure out my brain, so I need some help. Does that resonate with anybody?
I would say that what's resonating to me about that is that, especially when you talk about the invisible things, is especially, at least in my experience, also being where I am that, and they want you to prove it because they can't see it, you know. So, and I think that was one of the things that kept me from pursuing further as my own self-advocate growing up and into adulthood. Is there something really going on with me? Is there something that's deeper? Because I got tired of having to prove it. Like, oh, you're just the fat black girl, so you're just tired because you're lazy. Not because you're anemic and I have to get iron infusions twice a year because I'm anemic. I just can't produce the iron. But it took a long time for me to individually accept that about myself, let alone trying to talk to other people about that. So I think sometimes when you are the first and the only, if you have other labels tied to you, it's more of it's not even just a checkbox. It's like, no, you gotta prove that you can even check the checkbox. And have 20 questions, 40 questions, 100 questions given to you, because that's not how that person of authority is viewing you.
Because clearly you're faking it.
Clearly.
Yes.
Yeah.
So I feel lucky that I've somehow avoided the drug seeking label, even though I've been prescribed drugs that I feel like I should have gotten that on my chart at some point, but I don't know, they don't, but it's probably because of my skin tone. And I bring that up a lot to my doctors, and I think some of them are like, oh, I have probably done that to somebody else. So speaking up, right?
Yeah.
I don't want somebody to be the first in that office to say it's because of skin color you're drug seeking.
Yeah, or you grew up in the hood, or we don't, you know, this and that. They could always find excuses for you
Yep.
for why it's not as opposed to you saying this is what it is, and just being listened to and trusted that that is the case. And I think for a lot of people that might already be in a category where they're already prejudged and prejudged unfairly, that, you know, whether coming out as LGBTQ plus or disabled or both, I would imagine, it's even harder, because here's another thing they're not going to believe me on. Here's another thing that I have to prove somehow that I am truly this.
Doesn't everyone want to identify as disabled? They're like fighting and lining up at the doors to like get those disabled permits, like kicking each other.
I
It's
mean,
like,
parking spaces are great, but otherwise, you know, it's really not worth all the trouble.
and like the more intersecting identities you have, the thicker your mask has to be, so you
Yes.
have to peel them off one at a time, and I can't even imagine. Like, being a white person, my mask is nice and thin because especially on Zoom, I can just sit and nobody is the wiser. They don't know if I can stand that day. White Andy.
Is it okay to add just as like in the stew, just like a sprinkle of cynicism?
Yeah.
Okay,
Yes. I welcome it.
I think that there's this, like, what I keep thinking about, there's this part where there's like the invisible things, but I think there's an invisibilization. Because like, I believe that there's folks that they consciously know, and I'm trying not to be a nerd, because like people who know me know, talk about the brain a lot. Yeah, but like people, like there's really two different processes that happen between your unconscious brain and your conscious brain. Like there are two different parts of your brain, and they don't always work together. That's the reason why you might get like really upset, strong emotion at all that might come from your limbic system, and you'll do something and you think back and you're like, why did I do that? Because you weren't thinking rationally, and that's okay because the rational part of your brain is in the front, kind of like this. So I think like what happens is that people, there's a part of it I think people are engaging with DEI and equity work with the conscious part of their brain. They're thinking about their thinking and are using this part where they're like in this training for 2 hours and like, yeah. Because in the training, if you give someone a case example and say like, hey, do you see the issue here? They might like, this reminds me of Tamara Wilkins' white supremacy culture principles, and I'm going to do this. Well, you know what? When you're on your like 4th Zoom meeting and it's like 2:30 in the afternoon, your coffee's wearing off and you have to pee and your dog has your bra in the background and you have a 4:30 deadline, if something falls, you're not going to be like, I think this reminds me of Tamara Wilkins' white supremacy. That doesn't happen. Because that is the part of your brain, that's the autopilot part of your brain. It just goes. It doesn't think about your thinking. It just thinks. That's not the part of the brain people are engaging. They're not taking this training material and going back and applying it into their lives. They're not really doing the reflectiveness that's required for it. They're not taking it and letting it seep into their bones and in their blood. They are learning language enough to get themselves in trouble and to be dangerous.
Oh, yeah.
So there's a part of this where I think when you start to, and hopefully, like, the clients, we can talk about this if you're watching it, because there is a way. But, you know, you talk to people about this stuff, you know, in trainings and development and coaching, and then there's these life tests where they have to put it in place in their everyday work. And you see disconnect because you know they can sit there, they can recite James Baldwin at you, and then they can turn around and do the opposite. And so when I gave a training where, especially to this point, where some, you know, it was 2019, they didn't know what was happening. I had already got yelled down because I had suggested hybrid workplaces because I grew up with a disabled mom who'd been trying to work from home since Windows 95. And, you know, I said, you know, the ABA doesn't technically require you to have a doctor's note. So you know that the medical system is homophobic and transphobic and classist and racist and anti-black and anti-indigenous and xenophobic, then why don't you send someone there to get documentation for something they need? Just work it out with them. Treat them as why is it their own body? This person stands up in a huff. Well, what about attrition? What about shrinkage? What if someone tries to fake it? And I asked him, what percentage do you think might try to fake it? He's like, oh, maybe 3 to 5%. So you're going to make 95 to 97% of disabled folks go through this hostile accommodations process because 3 to 5% might be trying to game the system. There's a part of it where I'm like, I think where my cynicism comes in is people are aware of, I think, morally, ethically, like what the argument is. And now we're in a space of like, how do we get people to move, either move in a direction where both the product and the process is going to be equity, or move in a direction where they're not going to actively harm us and kill us.
That reminds me a lot of, we had a bit of a chat before we came on, and we were talking a lot about language, and that's come up a little bit in this conversation, and how the different terms that we discuss and use affect how we, interact with each other. I mean, my whole business shtick is, I'm an autistic linguist. I help you communicate with and learn how to actually use language. So it's very funny that you all gave me that without me even saying anything. But it was I wrote down specifically this quote: "We need to help people claim the language, not make it something that only they use." And this is specifically about academic jargon and terms, because when we use these terms, when we make them ours, they become common language. They're not just jargon. So it's up to us to determine how we create language, how we create our society, and that comes with, like you were saying, Christiana, embodying these lessons. Like, that's a very key point, I think, to all of these things. And Alicia, you probably have something to say this too about working in corporate, DEI work. It's like they don't want to embody it.
They don't, and it's a thing, right? And when we talk about identity, I think about, again, someone being relatively new. I'll say the past 3 years of getting into disability inclusion and what that means. I'm still learning language. I'm still learning, identity. And I think the two biggest ones, and thankfully we have a couple of really great activist advocates that work for us that are also disabled that do this around our advocacy piece, which is, being able to understand, identity first versus person first. And we all hate categorization. We are all our own individual person. And so it's that top of mind reminder to know that I am engaging with this one person, genuinely as who they are, and they're someone that is person first identity. And then when I'm working with their colleague, their identity first. And I'm like, I show respect by understanding that and knowing what that means for them. And I think that when we're in positions of being asked to do this, we have to put our personal pride to the side. Even if you think you know best, or oh, this is dumb, or oh, this is a waste of time. Finding that space to be respectful of what a person is and how they want to be spoken to and what language is their language. Because there's more than one language. I mean, there's more than one language anywhere. And I think if we regard it in that same way, it does make it a little easier for the solo person or the first in a group to talk about those things and to be able to model it so that someone does feel like they can talk about it, that they can feel like someone understands and relates, or even for that person, for them to learn more about where they are. Because when you're coming into something new, like a baby, you got to crawl before you walk. Even though someone's trying to get them to start running, and we trip over, and it's a whole thing. So creating those spaces on both sides of that, to me, is really important.
And also, I wanted to say, I think we all hate categorization, but we all kind of love labels sometimes.
Yeah.
Because having a disability that you can name is just, it's this weird relief, grief thing that you're like, oh shit, there's something actually wrong with me. But also I'm not crazy, right? I'm not imagining this. This is not a psychosomatic illness that I have created due to some other illness like anxiety, which is still a real disability. Thank you.
Yes.
But we love labels because we can fit into them, but categorizing is fitting people into labels and not
Right.
using labels to apply to people as ourselves. It's like
Exactly.
nothing with
Yeah.
nothing about us without us. Yeah.
And that's, and I wanted to bring that up because, again, person first, identity first, some of these are terms that some people might be new to, and so, I like to, bring that in and just, so it's basically the difference between me saying I am a person with autism versus saying I'm autistic.
Right.
And I like to, bring that back to even different ones of my own personal identity sometimes will be person first versus identity first, because I am autistic with ADHD, or I'm autistic with hyperflexibility, or something like that. And so there are aspects, I'm a person with some conditions who is also an autistic person, and that brings me kind of to this next thing, and we've kind of been fiddling around with it, and I wanted to go to you, Emma, because you actually already started it when you were talking about that, but which is advice for people coming into this space, advice for people coming out as disabled or queer, or do you have any advice for people who are thinking about becoming squeaky wheels or want to become stronger squeaky wheels?
I definitely say, so 2 things. 1, if you're not sure you want to disclose your disability status, don't.
Yeah.
You can always do it later, and it cannot be taken back. And oversharing medical information is something I've seen people get into a lot of trouble with in workplaces, where they thought they could trust people that turned out to have some views that they didn't know that they had. And that can't be taken back, and that's, personal medical information should always be held very, very close to the self, even if you trust people at work. And second is that never be afraid to seek a second opinion, whether that's your doctor, your therapist, your mom's best friend, maybe even yourself. I definitely thought that I was just fat and out of shape, and that's why I was experiencing pain all the time, and my doctor was like, yeah, that's probably true. Which, she was listening to me. She said, that's what you think is happening, then sure, I'm going to go with that. But definitely seek second opinions when you need to. Break up with doctors when you need to.
Yeah.
Don't let yourself go through trauma just to try and get answers. You won't get the right ones, and you won't like what you're getting and as you're getting them. But definitely, to be a squeaky wheel, I say wait until you have the spoons. The spoon theory of energy and ADHD. I am so sorry, I cannot remember who founded this, but please know that this is not my original idea. Basically, you start the day with a number of spoons. This is your energy expenditure level for the day. If you start with 5, you take a shower, you have 4, you make breakfast, you have 3. Now you have to kind of apportion those 3 energy units throughout the rest of the day to try and figure out how you're going to do it. Are you going to have lunch? Are you going to skip lunch? Are you going to maybe go to bed early because you're exhausted and you ran out of spoons at 3 p.m.? And some days you're going to start with 2, and some days you're going to start with 7. So it's kind of like, disability changes from day to day, so does just everyone's energy. So I say wait until you have enough spoons to do things, because you don't want to be running on fumes and running on negative to try and help others. You got to put your own mask on first.
Cool. Christian?
Question everything.
Question everything.
Everything's a construct. But because everything is constructed and absurd, we can create and construct a reality. We just have to deconstruct the system first. Always assume that the first plan that you make is going to be the plan that you hope will happen, and then you should make a couple of plans for what you think will happen. Because there will definitely be some. Because human's human. So to make a plan that's the perfect plan, then make a plan that has human error in it. And not just your human error, other people's human error in particular. Always have a safety plan, have an emergency preparedness plan for everything, not just for the climate disaster, but also for everything.
We live in earthquake country.
Yeah, have an emergency disaster preparedness plan for what happens if I get a migraine, doing this event. What happens if I'm in the middle of a training and I get sick? Always have a plan. I will say that I think we are heading into a really interesting time in our society, in the Western Hemisphere, in the United States, and this is going to be a time where there will be a lot of things to consider and things to navigate. If you do have these experiences and you do want to, contribute or be a squeaky wheel or come out as disabled, it is also okay to inventory your spoons, your hit points. It is okay to assess your safety and the situation. And if you are, especially if you're intersectionally impacted, to focus on your health and your survival. Because you are giving of yourself when you're doing this work. I think it's important to really do an assessment to ensure that it is the wisest use of your energy if you need to survive. So I think it's sometimes, if there's someone out there who's been like, I really want to get involved, but I'm too sick, or I don't have the money, or things like that. There's, of many tiny sparks comes a mighty fire. There are small ways you can get involved that does not involve you having to go out or march or be on panels or anything. I mean, this is fun. But, if you can't, or you see like that things are happening in person and you're stuck at home or something like that, just know that it is okay to put yourself first during that.
I was going to wrap that up with both of what they said. I just call it self-advocacy, and that differs by the person. My level of self-advocacy is going to be different from Emma's and Christiana's. It's and a part that really is about owning your space, owning what's going on with you, owning what information you do want to put out there. Because again, what's is out there is out there. So getting yourself into a training and in a position to own what happens with that. I am a serial planner, so it's plan A, plan B, plan C. Like, I see all of it out there, and frankly, that comes from being a black woman in corporate America, where my colleagues will put out an idea, they go, "Oh, great, let's run with it." And if I put it out there, it's like, "Well, what happens if it fails? What's going to happen with this? So you already have to have your contingency plans already thought about, even before putting out the idea. But it trained me for the better, as much as I hated it in that moment. But again, it's part of that whole self-advocacy going, okay, if I put something out there, one, I got to own what I put out there. Two, I got to know where my boundaries are. Three, I got to know what kind of support systems, plural, that I need to be able to execute that. And then finally, what if all else fails and it's still just me? What am I doing to protect self? And if that means sometimes withdrawing from a situation, then that's what you do. In my mind, I want to break some of us out of this mentality of we have to always be the flag bearer, that we always have to be the ones that march through. I won't go into it here, but I mean, I found myself in Spokane last week, and due to a series of unfortunate incidents, I left early. Like, I left the work unit early. I was like, I changed my ticket, then I called my boss and said, I am leaving. This is not a healthy place for me to be in right now. And she supported that, even if she didn't. I had already changed the ticket. But again, that's a self-advocacy thing, right? It's like, I think there's a time where I would have been like, oh no, I'm here, and I have to push through, and I got to try to find that pocket of acceptance to where I feel comfortable. And I'm like, no, I can just leave. And so I hope that that's something else that people can start to incorporate in their own self-advocacy of how much they don't have to deal with.
Yeah, I so love ending on that note, because like that is really what this is about. Is I come into these spaces and I bring myself. I agree 100%. I bring my self-advocacy because I know that there are other autistic people, there are other ADHD people, there are other queer and Latinx and all of these other people that aren't able to speak up. And so, yeah, I'm really glad that you brought us down on that point. So, yeah, and if you know, oh, that's what I was like, this is why I write stuff down. Okay, you had the best, you opened my eyes to a factor I hadn't actually considered that was draining my energy to racism, because again, light-skinned, I don't know how people actually see me, so I never assume it's racism, but it often is. And I didn't even tie it into the idea that I create contingency plans before I present ideas, because I do expect my ideas to be doubted, and so I have, and I'm always confused when other people present their ideas as like, yeah, let's just run with it, and I'm like, I try to do that and people get mad at me because they're like, well, it will go wrong, and I'm like, but we will figure that out, right? Because that person said it.
It's almost like a survival response or something.
I know, right? So thank you for, I learned something. We learn every day, you know, that's why, even in this like leadership role, we're learning.
Don't stop learning until you're dead.
Exactly. So I want to thank you so much for the conversation. We have, we're still hanging out. We have time for a Q&A. So I wanted to open it up to questions and answers. But first, I want to give a round of applause to our fabulous panel. Thank you so much. And yes, I believe we do have some audience questions already from the YouTube. Do we want to go to the YouTube question?
Yeah, can y'all hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Hi, I'm the question bearer. I'm Nick. I'm a program coordinator here at Seattle Pride. So thanks for being here. The first question we have for all on the panel is, have Pride spaces become more disability inclusive over time in your experience? And have disability spaces become more LGBTQ plus friendly in your experience?
I'll start off. I'll take the second half of that question, being working for a disability-centered organization. I will say that over the past couple of years, we have made a very specific and deliberate actions to make sure that, again, we expand and really go into what our DEIA really is, and having these types of conversations so that we can start talking about the LGBTQ community, as even with the persons that we serve. It was just something that was never talked about. I don't think it wasn't talked about purposely. It was just such a focus on that silent D, as I called it before, with disability. But it's like, right, intersectionality has become more than just a buzzword now. It is a real thing. So I'm seeing that in our organizations and other organizations that serve persons with disabilities, looking at what does this look like, especially during COVID, because a lot of the folks that we serve end up becoming essential employees in places. And so there was no working from home for them, or our job coaches and employment consultants as well. And I think it ended up kind of exposing some other workplace situations that might have been a bit troubling, such as accessibility in some places, and also within some discrimination of LGBTQ plus community. So it's been a new journey for us in looking at this from the inside out as well as the outside in, and making sure that we're having those conversations on the regular and making sure that it's part of what we're doing and what we talk about. And even engaging with potential employers, making sure that there is a strong acceptance within their organizations, and even doing the research on their companies to see what others have said about them in the past, because we will not partner with any organizations that have a history of discrimination. But it's something we never actively looked at before, until maybe the past 3 years.
Yeah, I was going to say, at least in the past 2 to 3 years, I've seen a really big move for accessibility in queer organizations, but also in workplaces in general. Partly because every single disabled person that has any condition that causes them to be in any way immunocompromised has suddenly found working at home to be literally a matter of life and death in some cases. So we don't have a choice but to advocate for ourselves. I know before COVID it was definitely more optional unless you had to commute into work, in which case it was tough, but it wasn't as immediately relevant. I feel very fortunate to live in Washington, which is a state that actually, closed down when it did. A lot of my friends lived in states where it didn't and ended up losing their jobs, losing homes, having their families have, very immense trouble navigating that. And honestly, I've not been involved in as many disability spaces to be able to say whether they've become more queer friendly, but at least in Seattle, I found that it's a little bit easier to talk about being queer than it is to talk about having a disability. Partly because people are really sweet and they're like, oh, but you don't look disabled, or like, we're differently abled, and I'm like, oh honey, I'm not going to use a euphemism, don't do that to me. I'm sure that says disability is not a bad word. That is the case for me. If someone tries to tell me I'm differently abled one more time, I may hit them with my cane.
And this is just my travels. My travels has been that the disability spaces that I have been in have always been queer friendly. I don't know if I can quantify it with a study, but I feel like the intersection of disabled folks and queer, trans, non-binary community is pretty much just a perfect circle. There's not really that much overlap. It's just they're all there. The other way though is different. I think that you were talking in the beginning about how perhaps the pandemic and some of the infrastructure we built might be able to maintain, and then people might be able to go, say, to the Pride Parade virtually. And I know I can't stand for more than 45 minutes. So I can't go to a parade. I used to go to rock concerts all the time. My Chemical Romance is coming to Tacoma. And it's only GAC tour will open, and I can't stand. So if I can't stand for one of my favorite bands of 2005, how am I going to be able to stand for a Pride Parade? And I do think that there's a difference between a knowledge and a wisdom. Knowledge is that you can read a book and you can gain knowledge, but wisdom is that you know how that knowledge is actually applied in the real world. So I don't know if it's that there's more folks masking in queer communities. I don't know if the overlay is not as much. But I think that there's still, especially in person environment, and I think even in terms of virtual, making sure there's captioning of heart and not just automatic captioning if you can afford it, and things like that. I think that what I will say is that neither of those spaces I feel have increased in other intersections. I think that there is a huge conflict within both queer and disabled spaces around racial equity and xenophobia and language justice and all these other sort of things, right? And I think that one of the difficulties about 2020 is that on the good side, people start talking about this stuff. On the bad side, people start talking about this stuff. And as a result, we've seen DEI banned at the federal level with Executive Order once, with 45, and now banned in Florida with a couple of other states looking to ban conversations about DEI. So you want to be able to talk about it. So I think that there's still more work to go. So much work to go.
Yeah, and that really is my experience having worked in both spaces for most of my life as a self-advocate, and it is very much better recently, and yet so much work still has to be done. And that comes to me in terms of again, the knowledge. There's a wonderful comic called XKCD, and one of the most famous comics strips that he created was about the magic 10,000, and every single day, at least 10,000 people are learning the fact that for the first time. For instance, Mentos in Diet Coke.
Yes.
Somebody doesn't know that happens, and me just saying that, learned it for the first time today. And that comes along with all of these other things too. We have to become more, I feel, accepting of people, what is it? I don't feel like people who are knowledgeable necessarily have to be as accepting, but that as ignorant people, when we don't understand something, we have to be more accepting of being corrected, or just learning, or just saying, hey, maybe I shouldn't comment immediately when I feel uncomfortable around a term. Maybe I should let the situation settle down and do some reading, right? Reacting.
Google.
Instant reaction. Maybe not the best option all the time.
Yeah.
So, yeah. Is there another YouTube question, or is there a question from the audience? Yeah.
I have more questions from YouTube and from what we collected from folks who are planning on attending or watching our stream. So, what are some of the most common employment issues you come across or experience, and how do you handle these challenges?
Ooh. Do you want to start, Christiana?
Racialized ableism.
Racialized ableism.
Racialized ableism is the biggest thing that I see as a consultant doing this work, because it's not to say other intersectional things. I think it's because there are two things that not only are really deep rooted into the country, but they've also intertwined. So, like, for example, blackness and indigeneity has been medicalized and pathologized to be used, you know, over time for state control, social control, eugenics. There's an Office of Eugenics that literally was a federally funded program in this country from the 20s to the 70s that specifically at the intersection of these things would essentially, I mean, we're not going to have a critical race theory conversation.
The 70s. I want to pause real quick. People in this room were alive when we still were funding a Office of Genetics, a eugenics office in our federal government.
I mean, the Civil Rights Act was only 58 years ago.
Yeah.
The ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, was only 31 years ago.
Yep.
Like, there's just been no time. And some of these things are hundreds of years old. They've seeped in like old grass stains from your youth into the fabric of the country. So there's like this. So I think when I think about employment, and I think about systemic racism, anti-indigeneity, anti-blackness, xenophobia, all these things, I think about systemic ableism and professionalism, the construct of that. The capitalist ways that disabled body minds are regarded, even down to getting social services. Everything is based on how much your body mind can produce or not, and that's how much money you get for social services. So, I mean, there's this point where I feel like it goes back to that conscious versus unconscious, right? Because if we have a conversation about racialized ableism as some organization, they'll be able to talk all day. You know, they might even bring up like Matthew Russian or something like that, the case. The black autistic youth that got sentenced 50 years to prison for being black and autistic and having pedal misapplication on this call. But I think that what's really important is really at the root of that is racialized ableism, but intersectionality, and the fact that there's intersectional erasure, and so like people will hyper focus on one thing, completely erase the other. So they might consciously be able to articulate that, hey, we have this black autistic employee, and we need to find out a way to make sure that they have an accessible workplace. But a black autistic employee has a bad day and they have a meltdown, they go in the bathroom crying, they're going to end up in the HR office with a written warning. And there's something in that disconnect that continues to happen, and we don't consider the intersectionality. And not just race and disability, but race and disability and gender expression and identity and sexual orientation and size and class and all of these different sort of things that I feel like really I think it comes down to not only I hope that one day infusing the principles of disability justice, which is a liberatory framework created by Black, Brown, Indigenous, disabled, queer, trans, and non-binary disabled folk. And incorporating that into the ADA and also overhauling our labor policies. We need to have a whole different structure for labor if we're even going to have labor. And I think without that, we're going to always have to deal with some of these disparities. It's going to require a lot of efforts.
So you're basically saying that being disabled, all of them, is the challenge.
Yeah, just being disabled and having intersections that have to be considered as a whole, and not just like a cluster of constituent parts, because that's how current workplaces in a lot of ways do it, and I think it's because their standards, not their standards, but the EEOC has all the different categories, and so I think they think of us like a cluster of grapes instead of a whole thing.
We're radio buttons and not check boxes.
Yeah. Oh, so true. So I do want to hear from both of you. I do feel like we talked a lot about business and
But I do want to hit on one point,
please.
which is, we were talking about this in my office today, actually, with my CEO. And sometimes it's just as simple as going back and looking at your job descriptions. You know what I mean? And so, we started doing that during the pandemic because when we started to, obviously everyone's working from home, we had to start and go, okay, look, when and if we ever come out of this, how much of a person's role can truly be remote at this point? So we started to rewrite all of our job descriptions to include that remote piece. But that also brought in, the spectrum too around what does that mean for a position to be remote or to qualify for that. And even today, even looking at some of our job descriptions and going, and some of you might already see this on ones that, might have right now, where it's like, oh, job description must be required, be able to lift 50 pounds. I've never been in a job where I needed to lift 50 pounds other than, the occasional event thing. But usually that's kind of standardized language that you would see on an application. And we were talking about that day and seeing how even through our phone screens, when we're, because we're hiring, because everybody is, and people are being screened out. And we're like, what's happening? There's something in our process that we need to change so that persons with disabilities that are applying for jobs are not being screened out because we're not being intentional. So we're already intentional on inclusion on purpose, by the way, to kind of tackle that mindset. So I think it even just comes down to looking at your current job descriptions and going, how is this inclusive to the disability? Does this role that we have, does this person have to be standing 2 hours or 3 hours a day? Or, but a lot of that language is still in a lot of job descriptions out there across the board. So it's being mindful of, let's just go back and look at what we've already been doing and see if it makes sense. So there has been some improvement even from us, a disability, geared organization, and go, we're not being as disability inclusive in our job descriptions as we should be. But again, I think a lot of that didn't come out until pandemic hit. So thankfully, better late than never, but it's an opportunity for all to go back and look at their descriptions and what is really required for the job to be done by anybody.
Yeah, I like that you say that let's go back and see if what we're doing makes sense, because I feel like that's really what we are experiencing as a culture, right? That is the crux of what we were talking about earlier, is like our whole culture was designed for one group of people to thrive. And maybe we should go back and look at all of the ways, the systems that have been set up to help that one group thrive, and see maybe if there are reasons that we should, change things so that other groups can thrive.
Right.
Did you have something that?
I did. I actually wanted to say the number one reason, or the number one thing I see in employment is that we don't build accessibility in from day one.
Yeah.
We don't build it from the ground up. We always end up adding it later. So I, like Sonatina mentioned in my bio, I founded a few ERGs. Those are employee resource groups. Basically in like corporate environments, they're groups of like women or queer folks or disability focused, accessibility oriented folks who will basically go to corporate headquarters and go, hey, this is going on, this is important to us, this is what we're doing. It's a lot of unpaid volunteerism a lot of times, and a lot of companies are starting to reverse that, which is really great, and actually pay people for their time, which is wonderful. But also, I've noticed that ERGs are basically like, if you think of racism or ableism or anything as like a wound, ERGs are stitches. They don't heal, they just hold things together just a little bit visibly on the outside. But you have to actually heal it from the ground up, and you have to actually change your policies and be willing to put a lot of money into things after they've occurred to repair trauma and repair things that you have been doing incorrectly for that many years. And sometimes that means going through your entire department and doing a whole compensation review, which kind of sucks. From an HR perspective, it really sucks, it's hard, but it's worth doing. So.
That's great. I'm glad I didn't move as long because I love that analogy so much. The ERGs as stitches, that's a great analogy.
Great analogy.
Yeah.
I'm still gonna borrow that.
Yeah, I know. I'm writing it down. I'm stealing it. Yep. What is it? Genius? No, what is it? Smart people borrow, geniuses steal. We have time for one final question.
My question just specifically around like I think you said earlier, and like self-advocacy. So I was trying to figure out what you do, since it seems like you all are doing a lot of work around this. But what are you doing for your own self-advocacy?
Yeah.
Was it to Alicia or
All
to
three.
everybody? Oh,
I was just gonna say, do you want to repeat the question?
Oh, sorry, thank you, yes. So the question was, we've all been speaking a lot about self-advocacy, so what do we do, what does the panel do in order to self-advocate for ourselves?
Good. For me, it's a learning process. Like it never stays stagnant to one thing. Like I said, when I left Spokane on Monday, last week Monday, that was the first time I'd ever done something like that. I was always in the mindset, okay, I'm here for work, and you know, I should be the good one and just try to push through. And I think over time and age, I'm like, you know what, I don't have to do that anymore. I don't have to, I've done enough of that. I've earned my bones in that. I think when I show up and end up being interviewed and put on boards and commissions where I'm the first, or if I'm to speak at some place and I'm just nervous, I'm like, it used to be a deterrent. Now, like I said earlier, now it's like, okay, you know what? If they're gonna stop and stare and try to figure out why I'm here and I have their attention, I'm gonna use that time. So a lot of it is just changing my personal mindset to be like, I'm gonna use you instead of allowing someone's discomfort of me to shut me down. Same thing in the workplace. I think it's also about making sure that I have, you know, allies, or actually, I'm gonna take that back. I don't want allies, I want advocates that are in there with me. That's not the word I wanted to use.
Spiriters?
Thank you. Thank you. You know, that are in there with me. I don't want someone that's just gonna be there for the good times. But again, that comes back on me. It's like, what do I need in certain situations to self-advocate? Knowing that I have, you know, a couple of people in this room that I know. I've presented with Cristiano, you know, before, many moons ago at Seattle U. And so, you know, so it's like, okay, there's some familiarity there, and I know Crystal, so I'm like, okay, you know, so I'm not gonna feel super nervous or being like the biggest one on stage. Self-advocacy for me is situational, but it comes over learning, right? So I have to do it differently for public speaking than it is for when I walk into my office or when I'm meeting with a funder for the first time and they're wondering, why should we write a check for $50,000 because this girl is asking, who doesn't look like a corporate banker, which I used to be, or doesn't look like my traditional fundraiser, which I am now. So it varies, but it came over time, and it's something that I'm still learning to do in different situations. So sometimes that self-advocacy matures. You know, before in that same event, when I was in Spokane, my self-advocacy was, okay, woosah, call a friend, you know, have somebody I can kind of like spit off to and then come back into the space and continue. And now, like, you know what, I've matured from that. I'm just gonna leave. Because I don't have to do that anymore. I've learned from that, and now I'm gonna try to do something different.
Emma?
I asked for a raise for the first time in 15 years of working in industry, and I got it.
Yeah.
Which is a lot of, it's a lot due to, like, I work at a great place, and, like, I trust my boss, and you kind of have to do the risk assessment, right? Like, if they say no, and also you're fired, you know, oh no, it's not likely, but, you know, it's always a fear. But definitely looking at what's possible for myself, like to try and undo that, like personal is political, the whole trauma that's been done to groups of people that I belong to. I have family members that are Ashkenazi, and I have my own disability stuff to worry about, and definitely advocating for myself in terms of like I deserve this because I think I do.
Just because you think you do.
Yeah, and it's like, and then I can go, I deserve this because I have decided that I do. You know.
Nice.
So first of all, I was debating whether I was going to tell you the truth or I was going to make up a lie.
That itself is a bit of self-advocacy.
That's valid. Yeah. But I think, the long and short of it is that, like how like crabs will like molt, like they'll have like these like dramatic situations and then their shell molt, and they're like have a squishy little pink self, and then they have to wait until they grow their shell. So I'm like in a squishy pink thing right now in terms of like what my self-advocacy strategy is, because honestly I've been sort of like in this state of disarray. Because it's one of those situations like doing this equity work, and you know all the statistics, and you know all the data, you know all the strategies, you know all the things, and so long story short, last year I knew all the statistics and the data around Black birthing folks and mortality rates, and how to talk to folks when I needed accommodations for going through things, especially a person with chronic illness going through the birthing process. But by the end of the year, not only did I almost lose my life, I did lose the life of the situation, and I lost like 5 clients while I was during my grieving period. It really broke me around like to what extent does self-advocacy help when there's these structural things in place. And I've sort of been withdrawn. This is like one of the first main community things I've been at since that situation. Some folks who are who follow me or in my space kind of know about that situation last year because I talked about it. But it's hard because when I said I didn't know whether to tell the truth or to lie to you, I could lie because you kind of have the canned answer that you could say, make sure that you. But I mean, if I'm honest, I'm in a space where it's like. I think it really broke me to go into an institutions that I've trained around issues that I know, like reproductive justice and disability justice, knowing the statistics, advocates, and people in solidarity. And it still happened, and I still became a statistic, and I still almost died. And so it's hard because I think it's not to say that I am not self-advocating at all, but it did created that situation for my previous toolkit and understanding of the world. Well, I can't trust that anymore. I'm re-enameling with
Reanalyzing?
Yeah, reconstituting my
Yeah.
But right now, if I'm honest, I think the only thing I've been able to do is the community that is able to sort of stand around me while I'm remineralizing. I think allowing myself space to grieve and cry, and really to see that space of I think there's some folks who are like, oh, well, those clients, they didn't need you anyway, they were going to leave you when you're, kind of thing. But I think it's also could be the universe is teaching me some lessons. So my hope is that the next time I'm on a panel and someone asks me that, I will have a new toolkit that I can share. But I also think maybe what I'm supposed to share is it's also okay to be in these molting phases.
Yeah, sure is. Thank you so much. That is amazing to close out on. And I just wanted to say again, thank you all for joining us. And the self-advocacy, I think, is the most vital subject that we probably did address today. And the key, I think, that came out of all 3 of those stories was that it changes, that throughout our whole lives, and that has come up over and over again, that we change and our society changes and our people change and we have to change along with it. And I think the more we accept that difference is good and change happens and we just need to go with it, I think the easier it'll be for everybody to just kind of like go with it and live life, you know, and all that. So thank you.
And that concludes our fantastic Pride Speaks. Please give it up for our panelists and our hosts. Again, on behalf of Seattle Pride, I want to thank everyone for coming out and for tuning in on the live stream. If you are here in person, we have 3 amazing Seattle Pride board members here in the audience. We have our president, Ramon Myers. You can raise your hand. Awesome. We have one of our directors, CJ Jensen. And our amazing board secretary, Gabriella Panisi, as well. If you're Seattle Pride staff, raise your hand, identify yourselves, we're around here as well. And our great team at Connors & Co., thank you so much. And to Unexpected Productions, thank you so much for having us here. As a former board member myself, I appreciate it. Thank you again. Feel free to grab things on your way out. We have stickers, buttons, a magazine. If you feel so inclined to donate to Seattle Pride, we would accept that as well. There's a QR code on one of the first few pages of the magazine. If you are coming to the Pride Parade, this year we have ADA seating at every stage, ASL interpreters at every stage. The ADA seating is free and registration is open for those seats right now. We also have food and beverage assistants who will be helping get food from the food trucks to bring over to you in case it's difficult to get over to that area. And there's other things as well. We'll have an accessibility guide on our website for you to check out. We look forward to having you. And again, thank you so much. Good night.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Conductor, yeah. Hope you enjoyed yourself.
Yeah. This is the first time I've done something like this. So
Yeah.
I'm excited. Yeah.
Good. Thank you very much.
Now I got some water.
Yeah. I very much appreciate you being honest. That is necessary because you're right. I wanted to like follow up a little bit and be like, I'm also just getting out of a whole thing because I had my circles are not as big, but like I was. The institution that I thought I had was training and was support me, kind of like a bit like train me, but I needed it. And luckily they realized that situation happened. We're mending, we are healing, but it is one of the things where it's like I was broken, my brain was broken.
Well, when you trust somebody or even something, you trust a doctor to tell you what the real statistics are, and you're like, I believe in that statistic.
And that's in my case, like I waited to see a black lady. When I saw that black lady, I told them about my fear, and this said to me verbatim, we know there's racial disparities in birthing, but we don't know why. I'm like, how can you look at me?
Oh my goodness.
Am I?
That is like, oh god, that's a maternalized shit.
That is that was the thing that just came out recently. Somebody just tweeted that. Like,
Well, there have been several studies in the last year.
their black maternal things are so much
We
higher.
have the highest non-white mortality in the world. Like, that's because nobody pays for the goddamn surveys. I just want to strangle people. That's why I got out of academia.
Oh my god, I yelled at the bike. Oh, hi. Oh, sorry.
That's why you're good, you're good. I almost handed my microphone to Gav to like steal.
Hey,
Take it away from me.
I totally, I